Hallo Freunde, es ist 10 Uhr in Redmond, Washington und es die Zeit für .NET API Review. Wow, that was like multiple languages. Uh, Fun times. All right, my screen is, I guess, exactly full with issues that we're not talking about today because they're all about ARM64 feature flags or something. Um, but yeah, things are starting to come in for .NET 9, so if you have stuff you want, get it on the list because now there's a line again. First up, additional quick connect options 72984. Also, anybody who's watching live, apparently you're supposed to be watching .NET Conf instead of doing what we're doing. There you go. That's my public service announcement. All right, quick connect options. Marie?
Okay, so this class already exists, and just FYI, all the systemnet quick namespace is still in preview in .NET 8, should be unpreviewed for .NET 9. So we got a feedback to include more options to configure new quick connections, and well, it was from James. And I would start with the first one, which is keep alive interval. And that's the option to turn on sending ping frames, which basically keeps the connection alive while nothing else is happening on the connection. We already have something similar for HTTP2 connection, but we have more tweaks in there. Well, that's keep alive interval. Any feedback on that questions before I move on? Nope. Then I'll move on to the last one, handshake timeout, because that's going to be easier. We already have a timeout for connection to idle out, and this timeout would apply to the handshake portion of connection establishment. Once again, we already have something internally, which is the provided default 10 seconds, that basically if the handshake isn't finished in that time, we will kill it, we will kill the connection. This is the same default as MSQuick has, and we would like to keep this value as default for the options. And we're just exposing this property for users to tweak it. So they can either turn it off or they can prolong it.
So this is a timeout after connection?
So this applies for the time when the connection starts being created until the TLS handshake is finished.
Right, but there's like a connection timeout, and then if like the TCP connection is established.
There's no connection timeout.
Okay.
Sorry, there's no connection timeout.
You said there was.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Emo.
So one question I have is, so this class is abstract. Is that because you share between client and server?
Yes, it already exists.
Yeah. So that basically means these are logically applicable to both sides then, which is why they're all on this type, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And do we have this in the BCL and other places where time span 0 and infinite mean the same thing?
No, that's one thing I'd like to say, that I think that defaults should be infinite, because that means basically do not send any ping frames. The 0, because we already have idle timeout on quick connection options, where 0 means leave it up to the implementation. Because we're using MSQuick underneath, and if we decide to change it for anything else, or if MSQuick decides to change their defaults, the 0 would mean leave it up to the implementation. Infinite would mean do not send the pings. And I would opt for having default as infinite, because that's what right now MSQuick does, and I'm not 100%, well, not 100% sure, 99% sure that's what the spec says, that the pings are off by default.
Interesting. So, like, I mean, I have no opinions on the spec, obviously, but the for Aspire, I know that we just like the default resiliency strategies that we inject for HTTP client all specified a maximum timeout. We don't have unbounded timeouts for those. But so maybe that's another case of those where, well, maybe that's what we do, but then as part of resiliency work for Quick, let's say we would have a default timer or something, and then it's just policy or whatever, right? That so it doesn't have to be in this type, right?
This isn't a timeout though, right? It's like an interval, and like really small ones don't make sense, right? Like 0 would make 0 sense. Like so we have to figure out what the behavior is in that case. Like none seems reasonable. Saying that it's implementation defined is effectively saying the same thing, since that is MS Quick's implementation, right? But
I mean, logically, isn't keep alive similar in the sense that it basically controls how long you hold onto resources?
No.
No, so this is like pings. Think of it as like a ping interval.
It's if you haven't already communicated in this amount of time, just send, hey, I'm still here, so the connection doesn't drop.
So basically, infinite is actually saying don't ping at all, which would basically be actually better, like in terms of resource utilization, you because you spend less time doing work or doing things versus a small ping interval would be, well, you know, you do a lot of work. Right?
Yeah, and like I would say that the default behavior of not doing that seems fine. I mean, that's what MS Quick does. That's what we do for HTTP2, I think. But yeah, I think setting this default to -1 and under the covers turning that to 0, and or by -1 I mean infinite, right? Is fine, and then 0 can mean the same thing, but that wouldn't be the default, like on this options type.
Well, isn't that kind of what we just said we don't want to do? Like what I thought Marie was saying is that we want 0 and infinite to be in different things.
Well, what would 0 mean if it's different than infinite right now?
So
I mean, right now it's going to be infinite.
So my understanding is that 0 would mean leave it up to the implementation. So if you knew up a quick connect options and you inspect keep alive interval, it would return time span 0. And it would basically mean, well, we have nothing specified as part of the options, but the underlying quick implementation, let's say MS Quick would say it's 400 milliseconds, right? And then timeout infinite times, so I don't actually know what number it correlates to, but that would basically mean, well, disable it entirely, right? So it would no longer be up to the implementation; it would turn it off.
Yeah, that sounds fine to me. Like, I don't know like how the native library works. I was kind of assuming 0 is the only representation of infinite for that. But like, yeah, I mean, if one is explicitly infinite and another is implementation defined, that's fine. That's probably better.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why we wouldn't just use a nullable other than that 0 is an invalid value.
I mean, that also works. I think for time spans, we usually haven't done that, though, because of 0 meaning effectively being sensible most of the time.
And nullables are a pain to deal with.
Yeah, I mean.
And we already have on the quick connection options idle timeout, which has the same behavior. Infinite means no limit, 0 means implementation specific, and any other number means specific timeout. So I'm just keeping it like stay same as the other timeout.
Fair enough.
But remind me, the APIs are in preview, correct? So technically we could make breaking changes here?
Yeah.
So at the beginning of this, did you say that part of this proposal is to take it out of preview for .NET 9?
Not of this proposal, but that's the plan for .NET 9.
Yeah.
Okay, but we're not like officially approving that as part of this meeting yet.
No.
Okay.
I would also assume that this is not the only API addition as part of .NET 9, right? So, like, I think it's totally fine for us to make random breaking changes in .NET 9, even if we approve for .NET 9 that this API is no longer in preview, right? Because, well, during the release cycle, you get to make changes, right? It wouldn't change anything. All right, so I think that's enough for this one then.
And the last four are receive window sizes. That's basically when you start the connection, you could and should tell the other side how much data you can receive or you are willing to receive. And these all basically apply to either connection-wide receive window size or, depending on the type of stream, whether it's bidirectional or unidirectional, or whether it's locally initiated or remotely initiated stream. And know that this is initial value. The moment you start consuming the data, the window will get updated automatically based on the speed, how much you consume the data from the stream and from the connection.
Yeah. So everything is suffixed with receive window size. Do we have anything that is not receive window size, like a send window size?
No. No.
That would be controlled by the other side of the connection, basically.
Well, but this is the common for the client and server.
Right. Each controls their own receive window. There is no real like send window. It's like defined by the receiver.
I got you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm only asking because the names are already very lengthy, and if we end up having to have both, then I would probably suggest build a struct that represents send and receive, so we can at least get rid of some of the stuff here. But
yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I like
alternative design. We have it in alternative design, basically like shoving it into structure, calling it like receive window size, and having these properties on that structure. We can do that.
Well, I mean more like if you have a pair, right? Because if you end up with initial connection receive window size to initial connection send window size, then I would rather have initial connection window size that has both a receive and a send. But given that you don't do that, individual properties make sense. And there doesn't seem to be an opportunity to make the names any shorter, really. But it's fine.
Yeah,
you can have a struct which just. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Because on the one hand, I like descriptive names. On the other hand, this is like as wide as my window.
Germanish. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a German now.
Yeah, this is...
Or we discussed something like initial window size that we struct, right? And then only one, so you could cut the 3 words out of each of those properties.
Oh, you mean like receive window size? If you just made this part of the property that is a struct, you would have initial connection.
You just say initial receive or initial window size, because those are the defaults you're starting with. The protocol can negotiate always more or less. So I think the initial and the window size is the important stuff, and then other remains would be the struct members.
Yeah, like if we really care about this being ergonomic, which I'm not sure we do, I think you're kind of like, matching the native APIs. But yeah, I do like the sub properties. So you have like the initial receive window sizes dot, remote initiated, local initiated, bidirectional, whatever. Does seem a little nicer. And then you can maybe even make those nullable and have a default if you want to like change them all, since they all have the same like value to begin with anyway.
By the way, Maya, do we know why the first one is so much bigger than all the other ones?
Because that's across all the streams on connection.
Okay.
Connection wide.
Okay.
And by the way, the default values are there because the specs basically says that the default is 0, whereas MS Quick has these values as defaults. So we opted to just show them up, because not setting this up means that you're not receiving any data.
Well, that's why I think maybe taking all of these. So if we make it into a struct, I think the whole struct, the property of the struct would be nullable. No, because you'd want each of the individual parameters. Because unless somebody wants to specifically set it, you should just let them do whatever the system wants, and then reserve the right to change it later.
So you mean leave it up to the implementation?
again, either so either this is 0 or it's nullable null of like.
So you're basically saying don't expose the defaults.
Yeah, because if we expose the defaults, we don't change them. So if this number is not coming from a spec, it's just what MS Quick picked as their default, then why would we pick that for the default for .NET for all time?
Well, actually, Marie, didn't you just say it did come from the spec? Like I'm approaching this from having implemented HTTP2. I'm not as familiar with Quick, but I know that in HTTP2, like there's kind of a default stream window size that like a client can like assume the server's going to get it to save, like give it to save a round trip. And then these settings are generally basically to adjust those after the stream or the connection is created. Like you can send the right window update basically. If in HTTP2 parlance. I realize this is like MS Quick, but did you say this was or the Quick protocol? But did you say this is protocol defined and you just expose those, or is it MS Quick?
The values come from MS Quick. The spec says 0. That's why we exposed it, because like when we do not expose it, the user might presume that it's going to be 0 because that's what the spec says. And they would have to go and check MS Quick and see what the defaults are.
I mean, I think Jeremy's point, I think it seems a bit weird that you would say for the time span one, you're basically saying 0 means implementation is specified, and you don't expose what the MS Quick time span actually is. But then for those window sizes, you're saying, no, we expose the things we're actually using. So it seems a bit inconsistent of when we expose the actual underlying defaults and when we don't. I mean, my personal take is that I don't quite buy the argument that if we expose the default values, then we have a harder time changing them, because practically speaking, there is going to be defaults. And if the user doesn't specify a value, well, the implementation will somehow depend on that value, right? They can handle a certain number of connections, or they complete in a certain amount of time, right? So us changing those values later will change the behavior of those applications, right? But I think exposing those values has the nice property that if you inspect this thing, you at least can log what the actual values are, right? Like if my app starts and I want to just log, well, what is the actual time that my app is using right now, or the keep alive time span, right? Like how will the user do that? Are they expected to pinlock into MS Quick and find out, or are we giving them an actual API? And it seems, generally speaking, when you have an API to set something, well, if I want to know what the current value is, it seems reasonable to ask that very API what the value is. So reporting 0 is not necessarily helpful in that regard, right?
Yeah, I think everyone agrees that exposing the actual default values is good, right?
Well,
so, yeah, I would just say I would do
nullable.
The exact same thing then for keep alive as well. It seems weird to me that we say 0, and then the rest we actually expose the actual values.
Yeah, like the only reason I even said nullable earlier, like when like referring to the subproperty, is like if for the stream window sizes, since they all default to 64K, like that was a property that then you could have more specific properties for like the bidirectional local remote initiated that could override those. But like I would still want to expose the actual defaults somewhere. And honestly, I think that the nullable thing's getting too cute. Like the subproperty is fine. I don't think you need like a default stream window size, and I don't think any of them need to be
I'm just
nullable.
thinking of things along the lines of like TLS protocol version, right? There were some points where we exposed some defaults. Annoyingly, there were points that we exposed the default and called it const. But we exposed a default, and then we needed to change it later, and then we had to go introduce this whole notion of like if you pass 0, then now we're allowed to do whatever we want. And so let's just make sure that any place that we're concerned about behaviors like that we're building in the right defaults to begin with.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, changing defaults is always going to be painful, right? But
in this particular case, and I know like you can't predict the future, like anyone who would be like getting this options value and using it somewhere else, like if we change the defaults in the future, like clearly just wanted to use like whatever the defaults were if they had explicitly configured it. So like we can change the defaults and still make it readable without it being null.
Yeah.
I also feel like it is fundamentally nicer if we expose the default values, because people can just new up the type, print the defaults in .NET 6 and .NET 7, and it will tell them what defaults have actually changed, right? So if we just hide them in implementation and do magic things with null and zero, it's like, well, it's cool, but then you actually don't know what the defaults are now. Right? We just make it harder to discover that they have changed, which in my opinion is not doing the developer a service.
Fair enough. All right, so yeah, do we want to do something about these names?
So what I heard was we would have a struct, and then we would have one property here called initial receive window size, and then all these ones we remove the prefix and initial and the suffix receive window size and make them properties on that struct.
Yeah, you do need to distinguish between stream and connection.
Right, but if you just call it initial receive window size connection and then local dictionary bidirectional stream, I mean, that isn't that what that does?
Okay, yeah, if that's what it is. So yeah, initial receive window size dot connection or dot locally initiated bidirectional stream.
Yeah, that's what I would think. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we happy with ints? We don't think we ever need long? I mean, hopefully not, right? But
what do we do? Like, is it in the native API effectively? Is it 32 bits?
I think they use uints pretty much everywhere, as far as I remember, at least for EMS Quick.
It's from the spec. Give me a second.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if you can't end up like by spec supporting a window size that exceeds that.
okay.
It's in HTTP2 and Kestrel for what it's worth. Completely different protocol, but
well, all of the concepts are same, right? So
it's similar. Yeah, that's why I keep referring back to it. So yeah.
Even like 2 gigs of window size, it's plenty, right?
Yeah.
Integer. All of them are integer specified in RFC.
And they're ins in the same way that ours are minus 2 plus. They're not just uints.
You don't want to like break the what's it called? What's the reason you can't use unsigned numeric types? CLS compliance. CLS compliance. Still, thank you.
I think VB supports them for a while now. It used to be the poster child of the language that doesn't, but I think they do now.
Oh, I thought it was that COM
that was obviously
express the difference between signed and unsigned. That was
I remember.
So is this what we're thinking?
Yeah, if the max window size is the same as HTTP2, it's int max value like 31 bit. But anyway, looking up the quick spec.
It does seem VB supports it, in case we care, but pretty sure F# supports. But I mean, we generally don't use unsigned types, so I think if we believe we want more than 2 gigs, we should consider using long, and then just validate that it doesn't exceed uint max.
Yeah, don't change it unless like we confirm that you can actually support more than a 2 gig window in Quick. I don't think you can.
Yeah, exactly, right. And I was just trying to make sure that we because that's one of those things that is hard to change later. But yeah, these sizes don't sound like you want 2 gigs. 2 gigs seems plenty.
Yeah, I think we should use long.
You think we should use long?
Yeah, reading the spec, it says that for integer values, it uses its variable length integer encoding, which goes up to 62 bits.
62 bits.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, what would we do if somebody sets something bigger than we cannot set to MS Quick? Would we throw?
Yeah, that's another thing.
PNSE.
Because MS Quick has smaller size.
So if MS Quick is smaller, I'd be tempted to go with that, right? Because we're not like providing like we expose a lot of MS Quick APIs fairly directly, right? It's not like we're seriously considering replatting. So
Fowler kind of said maybe
we
should.
Interesting. Okay.
There was some talk about a managed Quick implementation, right? So that would.
Well, that'd be cool. Don't unexperiment this API before we do that, or come to a final decision
I would agree
on
with
that.
I think what you said earlier makes the most sense. I mean, let's take a look at does our plumbing support larger than 2 gigs, and then what's the value? Because if it's according to Quick, positive integers only up to 62 bits, then long is also the wrong type, right? Then it would be ulong, really, right?
Long is fine for up to 63 bits, right?
Long covers 63 bits.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, of course. Never mind. Math is it was for some reason I was 64 is the same as 62 because I didn't have enough coffee yet.
By the way, we already have some longs as exposed, like for stream counts. I think that also can be only 62 bits. And what we do is when we validate the values, we just throw an exception that the value is out of bounds. So we can do the same thing for this. Do it long, and if it's too big, just throw an exception.
But if I'm understanding, like the difference is that's a long. The stream count is a long in the MS Quick API, right? And the window size isn't.
Well, I would say if the spec says 62 bits and then MS Quick happens to be 31 only, then I would probably still go with long.
But the 62 bits is just whatever the spec says for a variable sized integer, right? Like what they're probably saying here is if you specify something smaller than a short, don't send more than 2 bytes. Is my guess, and they're just using a we built in an integer because, like, saying you want long is basically saying build me a network buffer page more than 2 gig that I can store this stuff in, and then be flushing that out to the network. Like, you're never gonna do that.
Some people might.
You can hint to the OS, and it's probably not going to do that. Like, so since especially because these are just initial values and startup hints, I think capping it at int.max value is probably fine.
I'm starting to agree more with Maria. Like I'm looking also at the MS Quick like settings, and they claim it's a UX64.
Okay, we can go long.
So I suggest in order for us to make progress, just take a note and say, look at the spec, and then if the spec says long, we just change it to long. Like we don't have to read the spec in this meeting, but I think my generally other pet peeve would be just do a pass over all the APIs and make sure that every time we specify in, we really mean in, and every time we say long, we really mean long. Because that seems like the kind of stuff we should get right for .NET 9.
Yeah, we are planning to do a review before we remove the preview flag, so I think we'll have sort of overarching walk through the APIs just to make sure we feel happy with them, and if there are concerns, we can bring it back here, or as you said, if the spec is clear about that, we can act on it.
Yeah.
It should not be quick stream window sizes because it contains connection as well, and it should not be connection receive, but just connection, because the receive is going to be used in the property in the quick connection options.
Right. Yeah. What we said earlier is if you just hit connection and then local stream bidirectional, or actually, I like the original names better. So locally initiated bidirectional stream, remotely initiated bidirectional stream, unidirectional stream.
Yeah. And that seems fine. I mean, that also. And then presumably we would call the type
quick window
receive,
sizes,
right? Quick receive window sizes, right? Because they all receive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, is the type always
That's fine.
guaranteed only used in receive?
As far as public API, yeah, because you can't like control it otherwise.
Well, because if the same sort of thing was used to report what a negotiated state was, that's really the question.
I mean
that'd be
window
an
sizes is
interesting
fine,
API.
but then I think you still want to change the property name at least to initial receive window sizes or something, because in like the receive should go somewhere, right?
Yeah, I agree with that much. It doesn't need to be in the type name, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it should go.
Right.
In the property name.
That was the.
Yeah.
That's where I was going. Is if we want receive, it's more property name than a type name.
So you want to change the type name there, yeah. Yeah, that works.
Okay, and then I assume these are all bytes, and everybody who knows what they're doing here would know that these are all bytes. So unitless is okay.
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah, go ahead.
These aren't settings that would be like communicated over the protocol, right? So like you would never know this for the other side, right? This affects how the other side like updates its, like they might not even have separate configuration for locally and remotely initiated, right? Like how would you know? But anyway, like it's strictly a setting and it's strictly for receive, but it will never be used for anything else. But if you want to remove it from the type name, that's fine.
Should the default for keep alive interval be infinite?
Yes, please. Because I think that provides clarity. Zero is confusing.
Okay, so I thought that I heard people talking over each other when I was asking, is unitless okay? So did anybody have issues? So let's start with, are we happy
Unitless?
with the names of the properties in the new type we've carved out? No objection, sounds like yes. All right, and then Stefan, you were making the point that you think that the receive can move from the property name to the type name, because it would never make sense to read this back.
I would definitely keep it on the property name. It's just, yeah, you're not going to use that type for anything other than receive windows. Is the only point I'm making. Like, you can't know that about the other side. Like, if they configured the locally and remotely initiated streams differently.
Fair enough. Anybody want to argue to add it? Anybody want to argue to leave it out? No one has opinions.
Yeah,
last speaker wins.
Yeah. So, and then you're talking about bytes when you're saying unitless. Like, should we put bytes somewhere?
Right. So we didn't put the unit name in the property anywhere, and if they're bytes everywhere, then that's probably fine. But if this is,
I was about to say, I think if the generality is individual bytes, I think I'm fine with unitless. If it's like kilobytes or megabytes, then I would say no, you have to put it somewhere, because that is not intuitive at all.
For what it's worth, that's basically how it works for all the Kestrel limit APIs as well. Like we call it like size or limit. We never say like bytes anywhere. That's implied.
Right, but if it was in like 640 byte pages, then like we should say that.
So.
Yeah, no, I mean, or if it was megabyte, right, instead of bytes, but it's not.
Right.
So yeah.
In multiples of fortnights. Yes. You need to specify that.
One floss dance? No? Okay. Alright. So we carved out the struct. We actually went back, and so the consensus now is expose the infinite default. Okay. And then I'll just say to a human 10 seconds is nothing, and to a computer 10 seconds is an eternity. So from somewhere between security and consistency perspective, consider how many of these timeouts you have and what they add up to together, and how much you're actually hanging a system before expiring any of your timeouts. So I would expect like 2. But
the 10 is what we use for TLS handshakes for Kestrel, for normal TCP connections with SSL stream.
Fair enough.
This is also MS Quick default.
Yeah, I'm just, once you get a connection, like a TCP connection timeout followed by a handshake timeout followed by a something else timeout followed by a something else timeout. Like, some of these things end up stacking up to like a minute. And that's a really, really, really long time to get something in a... Like, I convinced you to make a connection back to me, and ha 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 ha, I've tied you up. So... Alright, anything else on this issue?
Sounds good to me.
Ship it.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Looks like even though GitHub just rewrote their UI, they brought the old bug back.
Yeah, it's very annoying. Every time I see this, I'm like, well, I actually have cases where I post comments multiple times before I realize that.
Well, at least now and I think they previously, the button is disabled after you've hit it the first time.
Yeah, that's true. All right, next one.
Approved. Oh. It's not a suggestion or ready for review. Okay.
Dun dun dun.
I think I heard we wanted to skip this one due to lack of...
So this one, I'm inclined to say, because I played with it yesterday quite extensively, I don't think it's contentious, honestly, because the only thing we talked about last time was we are still concerned about this being breaking somehow, right? So I played with it and I could not figure out a way to make it break. So what I'm suggesting doing is ignoring the fact that we are concerned that it might be breaking. Is there any reason why we wouldn't approve it? Because if we generally think if it's not breaking, we would approve it, I would go ahead and say, let's approve it for .NET 9. Let's do it early in .NET 9 and then just see what happens. If there's any fallout, we can move away from it. But otherwise, I would say, it's a long-standing ward. It seems reasonable to fix.
So I think this falls into one of the categories where, everybody wants it, but I think we have existential proof that it will break. And for what it's worth, Michal actually posted a comment at the bottom end of the issue where he demonstrated a couple of breaks that can be built on top of your proof of concept. And I have similar evidence pointing to that being the case as well. So any sort of use of DIMMs would typically end up with bringing users into either compile time, so source breaking changes, or runtime breaking changes.
Notably, the runtime breaking changes are only if they are in a roll forward scenario. So they've compiled something for .NET 8, for example, and then they bring that forward to .NET 9 without having recompiled it for .NET 9.
So like wrote a library.
Yes, they wrote a library and it rolled forward. But that's also only if they have their own interface that inherits iRead-only collection and is declaring iRead-only collection as its own dim, because then there's no way to unify them.
Right.
And I think the while we have cases that will break, the overall consideration is how likely do we think it is that a typical .NET library, especially major ones, will have implemented iRead-only collection on their own interface and defined a dim for it, such that this will conflict in practice. And I think the answer we've seen from looking is most people aren't using dims. Many people just outright hate dims. So while some people could break, I don't think it's going to be a high percentage in practice. And it might be better to just bite the bullet and say, we don't guarantee 100% across, major versions anyways. So this is a minor nuance for like 0.1% of users that's not going to matter in practice. It makes the entire ecosystem better.
I mean, I think we say we guarantee you don't get a type load exception by having published a library.
I mean, we try. I mean, like, that's generally a true statement. I think there are cases where that's not true, but I think by and large, that's the bar we hold ourselves, at least for the API subset that we think is very, commonly used across our library space. I would generally agree with Tanner's point, which is, I would be interested in any breaking change that results from people implementing the interface that exists forever. I personally don't care for breaking changes that come from people using dims by extending our interfaces, because that is such a minor set of people that you're already talking the 0.0003 percentile at that point.
I mean, but that breaking change could be lurking in the private implementation of a NuGet package that you're referencing. And if
but they would have to use a dim. And I'm saying that is such a rare case that I don't care for that. Like I would care for somebody just building like something like my key collection example, where they just implement our existing interfaces, and that results in ambiguity without using.
But my point being that if a user was to find themselves in that situation, it would be impossible for them to work around the problem, because that's assuming that they don't have control over the offending library that was using the dims in the first place. Right. I'm not saying it's frequent, but if it will happen, this is going to irritate a whole bunch of people. Just saying.
So I wouldn't agree on whole bunch. I think the breaking changes that ASP.NET makes every release, because they don't have the same compat bar we do, is much more impacting than us adding a dim here ever will be.
Wow, catching strays. We've locked down. No, but anyway, I'm inclined to agree with you, Tanner.
But
maybe it's my ASP.NET background.
Yeah, but I think ASP.NET also views themselves as an application model, meaning that they don't see a scenario where like you are now upgrading instead of you got caught in a forward version, whereas we consider almost everything to be a library instead of an application. So roll forward is actually our default assumption.
So I think I would say, I would agree with that. I would say I would not use ASP.NET like as an example here, because they really don't have a library ecosystem to begin with. But I think if you look at dims, my argument for why I don't care is because I can do a report if people cared of like what do NuGet packages actually target in practice and whether anybody uses dims. And I would be shocked if the number is exceeding like 20 packages, to be honest. Like I think it's such a fringe thing. And so at that point, I'm okay with saying it's contentious, but I would just say the value add by us doing these conversions so that things finally convert the way people expect them to is such a huge win, then I'm willing to bite the bullet and say, yeah, those 5 guys are broken. Because I think it's that small of a number.
Can I suggest, given that we we've never ever added a dim to any of our interfaces in the past. The scope of this change is kind of big, so would it be possible for us to consider a smaller experiment just to see how that flies before we consider unifying all our collection interfaces?
So notably, we've not added any dims to our collection interfaces, but generic math is like all dims, and we've added dims both releases now since, and we have a number of people that are actively using those, and we've not hit any issues with those customers so far.
Is that like classical dims or static abstracts?
It's both. We've had both instance dims and static virtual dims.
So I would say, like, unless I'm missing something, I think this experiment is smallish in the sense that there's not a lot of churn by doing this thing. I think it's on the order of like a couple hundred lines of code. I would say I would do it early in 9 and then just see what happens. I mean, just doing it in .NET runtime and then just running tests for the entire stack, maybe something is already failing, right? I don't think there is, but like, you never know. For example, I wouldn't be shocked if like some reflection stuff is broken in WPF or something, right? Who knows, right? And then we can decide whether it's worth it or not still. But I would say I don't think we will ever get the data until we actually try it. And I think the only way to do that responsibly is super early in the release cycle. That's kind of why I'm saying, unless, I looked at the PRs, like they all seem to be like, if people use dims, funny things can happen, but then you're already so much in the fringe space that I don't care anymore. That would be my position on this. And maybe other people have different opinions here, which is maybe we should have more quorum, but I would suggest we just try it for .NET 9 and see what happens. Because so far all evidence is kind of encouraging. And that would be in the realm of breaking changes where it's like, yeah, it might be breaking for some people, but there's a huge value gain on the other end. So that would generally pass my threshold of it's worth it.
One other parameter to set, I think it's probably obvious to everybody in this room, but just the fact that we're introducing subtype relationships where there previously weren't any, that on its own right would be something that we might consider a breaking change. That's independent of the whole DIMS issue, right?
It's actually an unbreaking change.
Have done before. So that one we have done before, by the way. Like we've done this in .NET Framework, and it wasn't that bad.
Yeah, that's like in the breaking change guidance, adding a new base class is never breaking.
Right. Adding a base interface is generally breaking. This is the suggestion of we think we maybe understand a way around that break, even though we only have one rule of DIMS, and it's don't do this. But we'll.
Yeah, I mean, adding a base interface is breaking. There really is no way around it. Like like DIMS is the first time that we have a way to reduce the impact of that, but you can still construct cases where it's breaking, right?
But if we have this hierarchy, then this will fix the problems where if you get API that takes both iCollection or iRead-only collection, that now it's not callable because it's an equivalent match for a type that implements both. Once we have the relationship, the non-read-only version of the interface is now the better match because it's a more derived type. So this is, in many cases, an unbreaking change. It just introduces the risk of the dim diamonds.
And really, if someone's going to be broken, and we get this in before January, and so in for preview 1, then we've got 4 months till build, which is our biggest preview. And when build goes out in May, if we've not heard anything, then we're probably not going to hear anything until after it's too late. And at that point, it's so small that it's probably not going to be a big deal.
Yeah, and I think you have to think these APIs have existed like a long time. People will be using this in like 20 years, hopefully, right? And like, yeah, some people might break this release, but
I think it's a worthy experiment.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it's not breaking badly. I'm just saying the evidence seems to suggest that it's fringy, which to me just says, okay, we have enough evidence to conclude it's valuable, and we have a plan to assess the impact by doing it very early in the release cycle. And that to me seems to be the bar for an experiment.
Yeah, I feel like there's something about the iDictionary and iRead-only dictionary that was very much the thing that was going to trip people up. But I'm guessing the proposal's solving it because it's relifting everything back up to the top of the diamond. Because iDictionary is a iRead-only dictionary, which is in a collection of things, and the dictionary is a collection of things. So isn't it supposed to have a...
why the shared diamond doesn't exist when you have a collection that is both implementing iList and iDictionary? Is that what you're saying?
Well, because iDictionary is an iCollection of key-value pair.
Right.
And then iRead-only dictionary, which is going to be a collection of key-value pair.
Yes.
And so then but if both of these say they know how to implement iRead-only collection of key-value pair, shouldn't that be floating up here and this has to resolve the diamond?
So yesterday when I looked at it, it looked like they're at the same level, and so the runtime is able to determine that it's the same one. That was my conclusion for this. But
okay. I mean, it works or it doesn't. And
I mean, like, that's the thing. Like, I tried to make it based on code, and like I could not come up with a break. So, I mean, the example that Mial had was basically somebody uses dims, and I mean, I think that's fair, but I think that's not the thing we care about, really.
One thing that Michal proposes in that same comment is that whether it might make sense to scan NuGet for existence of such patterns, like derived interfaces using dims for names that are important.
Well, that one I can totally do. It will take a while to get answers, though, because it's not part of the normal scanning, and there's quite a bit of packages there. But as I said, like, I would be shocked if you find a large number of packages using dims, mostly because most of the library ecosystem is targeting older versions anyway. And then for the people that do use newer things, it's usually not for type system things, because if you have a design that requires type system features, multi-targeting for older things is just, mind-blowingly complicated, right? So
I will say there's a complication on us that this will introduce. And it goes back to this being an unbreaking change. We tend to avoid putting overloads that are both iCollection and iRead-only collection at the same level because of the ambiguity. Once we get this a year or two under our belt, we might stop remembering that there's a TFM minimum on making that decision. Assuming we keep saying we care about parallel and older framework versions, that it'll be like, oh, we're exposing this for net standard. Oh, it's not an issue because iCollection extends iRead-only collection. Oh, it doesn't on net standard. This is now uncallable if you call it from net standard.
I mean, that's true today, by the way. Like, we have plenty of cases where we don't take both. And so it is a pain point already. And I mean, the amount of code we still write that targets net standard 2, I mean, it still exists, right? But it's a sliding window that goes down, right? So I think I'm pointing out. You can always work around by adding another method, right? So
yeah, I'm just pointing out that it's an area of concern, not an area of blocking, just a thing to be aware of.
Yeah.
Would the new subtype relationships create any complications with respect to overload resolution?
No, that's what it'll simplify.
Okay.
So the way overload resolution works is when you have two members, what they do is they say if one is implicitly convertible to the other, then the other one that is not is the better match because it's a more specific type. And that works for interfaces, right? So you basically remove ambiguity, as Jeremy said. You're not introducing more.
Right, and we've had this a lot with I-enumerable versus I-list overloads, and those we've just generally been fine with. This is just now introducing it at the read-only collection and collection because they were always peers.
Do we have like an actual proposal on the types that this is going to touch? Because I see we have the original post, but that doesn't seem to include, for example, the non-generic interfaces, which it might be useful to include.
So to be clear, that there's no non-generic read-only interfaces. The read-only interfaces only exist on the generic side, so that's why it doesn't make sense to reconcile them with the non-generic ones.
There is one that we've discussed before that's not included here, which is IEnumerable and IEnumerable of T.
But they already have a subtype relationship.
Oh, right. That was just a discussion of DIMs, not a ignore me.
I mean, you're basically saying should we have the dim for the get enumerator and move next, all that bullshit, right? Not move next.
Yeah, but that's a completely different and separate discussion because I think it has different implications.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
once we do this and assuming we don't revert it, then we can also go fix, like, there's at least 20 different issues going back over the past 10 years asking us to fix link to check for iRead-only collection as well, and where we've said we won't because not as many interfaces implement it. So once this is in, and assuming we don't revert it, then we can improve that and cover more collection types better.
Right. Well, it does create the hierarchy everybody kind of expects to be there, and our concrete types already kind of try to fulfill that. So in that sense, hopefully everything is just better.
All right. So is the top post collect on what we're saying the experiment is, or at least close enough?
I actually haven't looked at it. I did it from scratch to just understand what I was doing, but I don't have any evidence to the contrary that this is not what I did.
So it's I collection, I list, I dictionary, and I set.
Yeah, I think I included iRead only. Yeah, it's already yeah. iRead only set is covered here. Yeah.
And I don't see immediately any other interfaces that start with iRead-only or anything.
Yeah. There are only these four.
At least for collections.
Yeah. But iRead only set is recent. I think that's what we did in .NET 7 or 8 maybe.
5.
I think 5, yeah.
Yeah. Recent-ish. Once you've worked here for 10 years, everything seems recent. 13 years, Jesus. Okay, never mind. I'm old.
Well, since I've passed my 18th anniversary, you're not that old.
I guess that's fair.
Okay. I think it sounds like
Anybody know what the last comment is about?
No.
Do we have a hinting attribute for that? I didn't know we had one.
And I'm not sure what they mean by patching the loader. Are they talking about writing a custom runtime?
Or
runtime host, rather?
Or suggesting a different thing in resolution to that, David Wrighton would have to load, or would have to write. Oh, this isn't C#, it's diff.
Yeah, it looks like it is an actual change to the runtime.
Yeah. And then the other thing I still have to go through is the observable collection one for .NET 9, right? We still want to push that one forward, but I think that will highly depend on our friends in WPF, whether they're able to do work this release or not.
There was chatter in that issue recently. People were proposing that we just enable a feature switch and we disable ranged events by default, so we don't break anyone.
Yeah, I'm still not gung-ho about that. But yeah, that's an option. The problem is still, like, if you build a view model that is neutral, it's still kind of fishy, right? Because if you build an app that uses, let's say, malware in WPF, then you're still screwed. You can't use it, right? Which maybe that's okay, but I think the direction we want to go for is that view models remain portable as much as possible, right? At which point I think you're kind of limiting yourself. What are you looking at, Jeremy?
Just a comment at the bottom, like adding contains on set is required, so there's a most specific contains on set since collection and read-only set both define it. So I'm just looking and seeing what the world looks like right now.
Yeah. On iRead-only set, I think it exists, but on iSet it doesn't. I think iSet just takes the contains from iCollection, which is why it looks like the way it does.
If there were two interfaces that each defined it, then we'd need to know it. That way, if you have a generic constraint that inherits from both, you can resolve.
Right, and that's what they did here, and I was just trying to understand.
Yeah.
So they're actually both. Oh no, because so iRead-only set defined contains without being iCollection. So it's this read-only defined it, and the other one defined it only in the non-read-only tree, and so it has to unify them.
By iCollection.
Yeah.
And the only reason why iRead-only collection doesn't have contains is because we wanted to make it covariant.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that this should go to collections. I don't know if this would go to collections contains or to read-only sets contains, which is an interesting implementation discussion. But
well, they both go to the same right now,
I guess
right?
it defined it here that way.
So yeah, either way works. So you just have to find one home, right? But I think it makes sense to say you take it from
so
collection because you're on the mutable tree, right? So that's where it would come from normally.
Right. So if you currently implement iSet and iRead-only set, and you've explicitly implemented contains,
right,
you would have already had to explicitly implement both because you would have gotten iCollections contains, and then the dim will give you an automatic explicit implementation of iSet.contains.
Yes.
So you don't gain new non-interface qualified members, and you don't break. Okay.
Assuming we change this in preview 1, how difficult might it be to revert it in preview 7 if need be? And that's assuming that a bunch of code might have been written in the meantime that builds on top of that assumption of new subtype relationships.
So when you ask how hard is it, I think I would generally say, like, I don't care about third parties. Like, I would be okay with saying if we find ship stoppers that prevents us from shipping it, we undo it even if that breaks third parties, because that's the whole reason why we would undo it. So the cost would only be in our own stack. So it would only impact our own pieces where we rely on that relationship now. But I don't think there's going to be that much in that release cycle.
Yeah, you might be right. I was, for what it's worth, I was asking about our stack.
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be basically you do the whatever the git revert syntax is, build, and if we see a bunch of link tests start failing because we started depending on this in link, then now we figure out what to do about that. And maybe
I guess what I was trying to say is maybe we shouldn't be designing APIs in .NET 9 that build on top of that assumption.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
We go the rest of this release pretending this relationship doesn't exist, and if once it ships, then it's shipped forever.
Yep.
I think our answer is if it makes it into RC1, we kind of if it makes it to RC1, it's really, 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 really hard to remove it. But if it makes it to RTM, it's forever.
I mean, we have made breaking changes in RC1 as well. It just means it's go live, so we support you. But yeah, it would be very unfortunate if that would happen.
Right. All right.
We should absolutely document the. Oh, sorry, we moved on.
What, that it's breaking?
Yeah, we should document the hell out of this so that NuGet package authors know how to react to it.
Fair enough.
Scream into the void.
That is how they would handle it.
Well, there's this other big breaking change in .NET 9 that we promised, which is we're going to delete binary formatter.
Everyone's going to be so mad about binary formatter that we don't have to care about read-only collection.
Yeah, I suspect that is going to be more loader breakage than this thing is going to be.
See, that Levi's response was to turn off his camera.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, that was an interesting...
He was being quiet and still for a while, and then I looked away, and then he disappeared. Then I looked away again, and his camera was off. All right, next up.
I'm just shrinking into a little ball of nothing over here.
Add an overload of Type.GetMethod, taking name, generic parameter count, binding flags, and parameter types. So it looks like it's skip the binder and modifiers of later, and just be the sort of middle ground based on the one above. Looks kind of fine to me.
Yeah, I want to say this is the one that I had called out last week or the week before would be not that contentious.
Right. So in the non-generic one, we already have this one. I think they're pointing out. Because I was going to say, it's a little unfortunate that we're doing the skip a parameter in an overload. Because the binder comes before the types in the longer version, but we've already locally done that, so it seems fine to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I looked at the API and I'm like, I don't see a reason we wouldn't do that.
Womp. Add binding flags, ignore access modifiers. 94536. Emo.
Yeah, so this one is something that we have discussed multiple times in the context of us responding to someone saying, hey, you have this super useful private API, could you make it public? And every time we talk about this, people rightfully bring up the problem which we have encountered with .NET Framework, where we did things like that and then promptly broke people who call the API via reflection, usually the exact same party that asked us to make it public in the first place, because their invocation was written in such a way that they only binds to the method if it's non-public. And then as soon as you make it public, they no longer find the method because it only looks for non-public and not public. So the suggestion is basically, can we come up with a way how people would author the reflection call such that if the member becomes public, reflection continues to work. And there's basically two ways we can do that, and they are somewhat complementary. One of them is an analyzer that just says, hey, you're calling an API, you specify non-public. You should probably also say public as well, just in case the API becomes public. And then one would not require any API. It would just be an analyzer with maybe a code fixer that suggests that. The other way we could do this is by saying, hey, maybe we should just basically effectively obsolete non-public and say, instead of saying non-public, just say ignore access modifiers, because basically what you're saying is, I want to call the API even though it's private, but if the API becomes public, well, I still want to call the API, right? That would not be something I would no longer bind to. So one way to do this is just say ignore access modifiers is basically public and non-public combined, and just has the same semantics. Based on what people said in the comments, it seems like it is somewhat controversial. I don't feel super strongly about the API, but I would suggest we should still do the analyzer, because I really have a hard time coming up with an example where somebody really wants to call a non-public API and really doesn't want to bind to a public version of that API. That makes no sense to me.
I mean, I'll ask it the other way. Why don't we just change reflection to say non-public means public or non-public?
Because that might be... I mean, that's a fair question, I guess, because, you can't have conflicts really, because the way...
because IL doesn't allow the
overloading based on modifiers, yeah. So you couldn't have conflict in that sense.
So it would just be the people who are expecting it to return false, or null.
You can have a conflict. The issue is that the reflection stack, it's got interesting behavior with regards to things like optional parameters and implicit conversions for some types. And so it doesn't always do an exact match, and sometimes it will, if you do public or non-public, then you can get a public member that is close to a signature that you were trying to bind against that also exists for non-public. It's basically a question of does the array return 1 or 2 entries.
Okay, I'll buy that.
And I also think it's a little bit confusing for you to say for non-public to return public, because it's explicitly saying give me the non-public members.
Yeah, what does it do if you don't specify either? Match nothing?
What do you mean?
If you don't include
public by default. If you don't specify public, public is implied apparently.
Which means public shouldn't have been a bit, it should have just been the non-public bit. But then we wouldn't be able to fix this way, so... I guess it's because they wanted the OR state, which you couldn't do with one bit. So.
Yeah. I'm kind of torn on the thing here. I kind of like the perspective of ignore access modifiers for the same reason that I just commented that having non-public mean public is confusing. So in the same way, having public or non-public is somewhat confusing, because you're basically saying give me this set but not this set. So I kind of like ignore access modifiers from that perspective, but at the same time, if we're going to have an analyzer that's telling people to not use non-public and to just use the combination, we're talking about an OR flag. And long term, if C# gets the feature that allows you to not type the full binding flags dot non-public, and it uses type inference to determine, you've got an enum here, so you can just do public or non-public, then there's not a lot of character saving or anything else. So the analyzer could just suggest to use the combination.
So is that you saying you think the answer is analyzer with no new enum member?
Yeah, that's what I'm leaning towards. I'm not completely against ignore access modifiers, and I think it does have some readability benefits to have that. just given the 20-year history of this and how people expect it to work today, I'm not sure it's worth the new enum member if we're going to have an analyzer that's telling people to fix it anyways.
Right, because the analyzer, because we shouldn't just put obsolete on non-public, because if you're already doing public or non-public, we're just creating noise for you. So it does seem like it's an analyzer looking to see, did you specify non-public without public, and if so, warn. And if you are looking for the one case where you actually say, no, I really, really, really want the non-public version, then you'll just suppress it. But yeah, I guess I don't care one way or the other. It'd really be, do we want the pretty print to do a pretty print that says that you wanted to ignore the access modifiers, as opposed to saying public pipe non-public, or comma, or whatever it does when you pretty print things.
Yeah, I mean, there's this one common dynamically accessed members. I have to be honest, I don't care. Because it's kind of like you're in the 1% case again, and it's like, well, you're linking, you're calling private members, and it's like, well, at that point, yeah, you may have to keep both public and private, but it's on a, ideally on a subset of types. So I don't quite buy the argument that it's a fuck ton of metadata that you keep. It depends on what types you're reflecting over, but for those types, you keep the metadata, yeah.
Alright, so on the premise of less is more, are we saying no new member but add the analyzer?
Yep, that's basically what I heard.
Okay.
I mean, if we really wanted to, we can still add the member later, but
sure.
We just have to change how the analyzer works. But that's...
Yeah, and if we did add the member, I'd want the analyzer to suggest that people take public or non-public and use the combined one, because that seems like it's just better and a simple code fix.
Alright. Two hardest parts of an analyzer, Emo. Cat and Sev.
Don't we have one for, like, it's not called robustness, but it's basically like
reliability, I think, right?
Yeah, that one. That's the word.
I mean, I think reliability had a very narrow definition, though. It was kind of like data corruption or something, which this wouldn't be. I think usually these things end up being in design for some reason, which I'm fine with too. Honestly, category, yeah, my KL for category is not very high, so either one works. And then I think severity, I think if we don't make it warning, the value goes down drastically.
I mean, I think we have a category called usage. So you're using this. We think you're using the API wrong.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. Usage also works.
Right, because...
What about maintainability, since that's, like, what we're protecting against is a user going from private to public, and therefore you being able to maintain your app over time.
That works too. As you can tell, I clearly care about the category.
I feel like it's always usage. So if you can do maintainability, you should go for it. If you can find a non-usage category.
Yeah, usage does feel like the category of we wanted an analyzer.
So. Yeah, and in this case, I don't think it's quite usage because it's not incorrect to say only non-public. It's not like a correctness issue there. It's more, we know users do this, we do this, so protect yourself for the future.
Yep. And Sev.
On by default information?
I would say information, yeah. Because we can always change the set in the future if we need to, right?
Yeah, I mean it's just a. Sorry, do you mean by policy or by code? Because by code it's easy to change. By policy, I don't know if we have, but I think that we'd be willing to entertain it.
Yeah, by policy is what I was asking primarily.
Yeah, so I guess really the question is, do we think this is... Yeah, so do we think it's the UI hint, information, or warning are probably the three that make sense. And information's in the middle, so it sounds fine.
Yeah, warning seems like it's a little bit too strict because we do know there are places where doing non-public can be correct and where it can break your app to switch because you might get more.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's more a, hey, just so you know, this might mess up in the future. You might want to consider it. You're not wrong, but you could also be better.
I guess it's true because we're saying the low risk that you needed to have done this versus the low risk of you intended to do it this way. So information sounds like... What's the difference between information and UI hint? Is that like blue squiggle versus like partial underbar?
So what is it?
I feel that there's a UI hint severity that's lower than information unless they're synonyms. And so I'm just asking what's the difference?
I don't think there is. I think there's just info, warning, and error, I think.
And none, but... Okay,
yeah,
I thought there was a...
I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but that was my recollection that there...
Alright. Error, warning, info, hidden, none, and default. Okay, so I think... And then info is apparently called suggestion in the editor config.
Yeah, there is error, hidden, info, and warning. These are the things that exist.
Okay, so I guess the thing that in my head was called like UI hint is actually called info. So that's why they're not different.
Yeah. I mean, why would you say info though? Because info is not that great. It's basically not visible unless you opt into it.
I thought info is the one you said.
No, I said if we don't go for warning, the value goes down significantly because nobody will see them. It's basically like our prep analyzers very often are info by default, so you have to turn the rule on in order to actually see them.
I thought we had the ability to have an info that was on by default, whereas the perf ones we had info but off by default.
Because info is you'll get the squiggle at the call site, I think. And
well, you get this. You basically, it's not a squiggle. You just see, I think it's like 3 dots or something, or like an underbar or something that shows up in the editor. So you get it when you actually edit the code, but you only see it. So if you just take an existing code base and build, you see nothing basically.
Right, but
you have to actually physically edit the file.
Their thing says if you look in the file, or if you look at the build output message list, that infos do show up there. Which is the difference between these two, is hidden doesn't show up in this list. but info does.
So keep in mind that so what you see right now in error list, the third thing, the info category is off by default. You have to literally click it to see it. But if you take a randomly sized solution and you turn this thing on, you get like 5,000 of those. So like, because it's basically every suggestion that the editor has for code style and all the other things. So in a decently sized project, that's usually a lot. And that's what I'm saying. I think in practice, if unless you turn the thing into warning or error, which is usually what we do with Perf Analyzer, somebody would go to the thing and say, turn this into error or whatever, or turn this into warning, you don't actually see it.
All right, so you're advocating warning?
I would say I would go for warning and then downgrade if we really get feedback that it's too noisy. But considering that I think it's almost always a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, well, it may almost always be a mistake, but how often is that mistake actually going to bite you? But
I mean, that's fair. That's the counter argument.
Right, because it is a true positive. Most of the time, you get the false positive in the case that you are explicitly avoiding the potentially better match to a public member.
Right.
But then there's the given a true positive, did it ever matter?
Right.
And that probably drops the actionable rate down to 0. I mean, not actually 0 because people have been broken by it, but like it's asymptotically 0.
Asymptotically 0. Nice.
So I think warning feels a little overreach, but if we're basically saying our answer is warning or off, then I don't know that I have an opinion. So,
what is the online grep tool again? Does anybody remember?
Grep.app.
Grep.app. I mean, basically, we would key it off of binding flags. Non-public, right? Yeah, there's a lot of those. Yeah, I mean, just scanning through them here, I would say maybe a third of them have both. So that means 2/3 of them will be flagged. Yeah, it might become too noisy. We will see.
All right.
Should we take a look at the Tensor ones?
We're staying at warning.
I would leave it and see what happens. I mean, my general concern is if you don't make it a warning, it's like nobody will see it. Basically, it becomes pretty useless.
Yep, just making sure that you weren't changing your mind as a result of your investigation there. All right. Generic overloads of existing tensor primitives methods. 9er4553. Ooh, we about to break into 6 digits?
Break into what?
6-digit issue numbers.
Oh yeah. So we reviewed tensor primitives, and we reviewed that they were only going to be float for the down level package. Now that that's shipped, we're looking at expanding this for the .NET 9 surface area. by expanding that up to support all the types that they make sense on. So expose generic APIs that take T, with T constrained currently to the minimum viable interface set for each one. So things like abs are constrained to iNumber base, things like add are constrained to iAddition operators and iAdditive identity. But it's the full set of API surface that we've already approved for Float, just expanded out to be generic now.
I have one question. Like, didn't we say that most people will just constrain to iNumber rather than using super specific ones?
We did. We believe that most people would constrain to iNumber unless there's a specific scenario that supports iNumber base. There's not and that is often better when you are for versioning reasons, when you have the chance to expand or optimize an algorithm in the future based on new additions.
Right.
However, in this particular case, this is kind of fundamental math operators we're providing in the .NET libraries. So there's more reason to make them more expressive, and they're not going to change. Add, for example, won't ever do anything more than add. So while we could constrain it more, and there's a note at the bottom of we could constrain these to be just iNumber base and iNumber, there's not a lot of benefit to doing that, and there is more benefit to making it the minimum set so that it is more expansive. And if someone defines their own, let's say, string type, well, adding strings together still makes sense logically for the tensor primitives add operation.
Sure. And so do we have existing methods that constrain to just these? Presumably we do, right? So that's not a new thing, basically, is what I'm asking.
Right. We've got some cases, and particularly the dims are themselves functionally that. The I star function methods are themselves that implies iNumber base already as well, since we did that for versioning reasons.
And then changing them, if we ever get them wrong, is not a breaking change so long the new constraint is because of the old one, right?
So long as it's
the new constraint has to go down.
So long as it's less restrictive.
Yeah. If it's less restrictive, it's not a breaking change. Is that what you said?
Yeah. So you could go from iNumber to iNumber base, for example, if you found that there was a smaller subset that worked. Just like you can go from where T is struct to unconstrained. That's safe.
But we can't go
from unconstrained.
Yeah, we can't go from iNumber base up to iNumber.
What? Why not? I mean, like, that means you would accept more inputs.
All iNumbers are iNumber
because
bases.
Existing.
So if where T is iNumber base.
You're saying, yeah. No, yeah. I think they're saying the same thing. They just use inverse wording to express it. Yes, okay, that makes sense now. Yeah.
Yeah. So with Float, my understanding is these were all going to be implemented using like SIMD.
Right. So
how do you do that with like SYNH on T?
We would do if type of we would basically say if vector 128 of T is hardware accelerated, then we'd call vector 128.signH, which we approved like 2 weeks ago as part of supporting this.
But vector 128 only supports specific T's, right?
It only supports specific T's, and that's what the is supported property is for.
Okay, so you'd be like, oh, so it's like, So the is hardware accelerated is in the T taking one.
No, sorry. It's you say if vector 128 of T is supported and vector 128 not of T is hardware accelerated. So you do the check of the T is supported and the hardware acceleration exists. And in net 8 we removed the restriction of where T is struct. So vector 128 is unconstrained. Because we wanted to be able to do things like this, we were using it for link, for example, in net 8, so that we could use vectorization from generics where they weren't struct constrained and still do the light up.
Okay, so for user-defined T's, this will do a linear equivalent of the operations.
Right.
But for primitive T's, it will use intrinsics, and they're probably only going to be used by primitive T's. But I'm just making sure we weren't shooting ourselves in the foot or actually needed to do this specifically for every numeric type we cared about. If we have a plan, then we have a plan.
Yeah, and then float in particular has the explicit overload that takes read-only span of float, so that will also be preferred in most contexts.
Right. And if somebody gives a read-only span of half, that'll hit the new generic, and not. Oh, okay, I guess because that couldn't. If they're once they're spanning it, it can't up convert anyway. Because spans
but
aren't
also
coercive that way.
Yeah, we also don't have half implicitly converting to float, because when we exposed it in net 5, it was purely an interchange type, and we had concerns over adding new APIs in the future that took half, and because of how implicit conversions work, that being chosen instead. It's basically the same issue of int prefers float over double for implicit conversion. And so if you had double and you add float, now you've got a silent breaking change in which API you're calling. So we didn't add the implicit conversion to half.
Fair enough. Alright, since it sounds like we're not setting ourselves up for failure, it seems good as proposed to me, assuming that all the wheres are correct. And I don't think we care to review them individually, you'll just figure them out as they come up.
Yeah, I already did some work to go through and make sure that they were right, but if there's anything that's subtly wrong here or a copy-paste error, we'll have that as the minimum required set in the actual implementation.
And remind me, like system numeric tensors, have you ever shipped a stable version of that one?
No, we never shipped that. We pulled it out, and then as of today, we should have shipped the new system numerics tensors package that has tensor primitives as its only thing, and we're going to be working on fleshing out tensor primitives here, and separately working on redefining the tensor of T surface area to be stable, take into account generic math and things.
Well, that's
and
not
making
what
sure
I
that
was
it works
asking.
for...
Like, I was mostly wondering, did you ever ship a stable version? Like, is our API already stable, basically? I don't think it is, right? It's still all preview, right?
For tensor primitives, it shipped today as out of band.
Ship? Gotcha.
Yeah.
But that was
that's
the
just
old
the
surface area, right?
taking float. Yeah, that's not the old surface area. That's all gone.
Gotcha. So it was, yeah, so basically what we shipped is only float. And then this is basically extending it to everything else.
Yep.
And presumably then this would ship as part of .NET 9 then?
Yes, that's the plan.
So if we get any of these wrong, we would find it hopefully then.
All right. Any comments?
Nope. Then my only question is, I mean, we should probably quit early because I don't think we have any issue left. It is 15 minutes. In terms of these ARM64 feed ones, I assume you don't have an order preference, Tanner, right? I can just batch them up in whatever makes sense in terms of time.
Yeah, I sent you a request last week, I think, but I think it got missed because everyone's been busy prepping for the release. But we basically just need to set a dedicated review period aside, ideally 1 to 2 weeks out. That way I can let our friends at ARM know, and they can attend.
Yeah. No, I did see it. I just haven't responded yet. Like, yeah, I mean, it seems like one of those things that we want to just dedicated review time so we don't do them all one at a time.
Yeah.
And then you said you want to invite the ARM folks, right? So I will just set up the meeting and then you can forward it to them.
Yeah, sounds good.
Perfect. All right, then let's do that.
Emo, you will note from your handy dandy calendar that our recurrence ends today. Are we continuing forward on Tuesdays?
No, this was it. This is it. No, we have all the APIs we ever have, and no, this is the end. Yeah, I'll set up a new recurring event, and then it's gonna be the same slot.
Okay. Yeah, it was. Okay. I didn't know if some of the team, new meetings, new management meant we were gonna move off of Tuesday or not. So.
Well, you never know, but like.
Yeah. So. All right.
Tradition.
Well, any of the we're up to like 21 people who never commented but are watching live. So yeah, thanks for being with us, even though you really should have been paying attention to .NET Conf. And we'll see everyone who wants to join us, presumably next Tuesday, here at our same .NET time on our same .NET channel.
See, Jeremy, they joined us because .NET 8 is old news now. It's all about .NET 9.
I was one of them, so counts one.
Yeah, I even wrote a message just to make sure that the message feed was working. But all right, Auf Wiedersehen.
Bye bye.